Survival from in-hospital cardiac arrest is lower with mechanical CPR than with manual CPR. That's despite all the large randomized controlled trials showing equivalence. This just doesn't make sense. Good CPR is hard and fatiguing, and machines make it look easy and they don't get tired. They must be better, right? Well, one potential reason for the results we saw in the Crowley paper from last episode is that deploying mechanical compression devices, or MCDs, turns out to be harder than it seems. And there's a definite skill to doing it right and doing it without interrupting compressions. The Levy paper from Anchorage demonstrates how to put it on while decreasing interruptions. But hospitals aren't exactly known for their team-based rehearsal and practice. Maybe the issue in that paper was these hospitals used the devices so rarely, and boy did they use them rarely. Less than 2% in that study used them, and most hospitals never used them at all. So maybe the issue is they used them so rarely, they were just really bad at deploying them. Maybe that's it. But I'll tell you what, you know what would be interesting? Well, I'll tell you what I would find interesting. What if a large EMS system with a history of doing really, really good, well-choreographed manual CPR did an extensive training process on how to appropriately deploy MCDs? Well, what if that system looked at their survival between well-done mechanical CPR and well-done manual CPR? What would that look like? You know, sort of a true real-world experience in a system that optimizes both approaches. Sort of the medical analog to the college football playoffs that are on TV right now, you know, where the best teams face off against each other. Theoretically, that is. I mean, you know, after overlooking, I don't know, the most blatant targeting foul ever that we just go, nah, not targeting, go ahead. There, that would be interesting. Fortunately, that paper exists. In 2018, my friends with Austin Travis County EMS reported on exactly this situation. And speaking of both college football playoffs and Austin, congratulations, as much as it pains my Aggie heart to say this, congratulations to the University of Texas Longhorns on advancing after holding off a great Arizona team. Man, what a great game that was. It was so fun to watch, specifically as somebody not invested in either team, because if I were, my God, I would have had a stimmy. Such a great game. Now, as I'm recording this, Oregon is playing Ohio State, and I use the term playing loosely here because they're not looking very good at all, and that is definitely not what I was expecting. You know, at least one of these two games was pretty good. And unfortunately, the third one that I thought would be great, the Sugar Bowl, that got postponed because of the horrible terrorist attack on Bourbon Street early this morning. My thoughts go out to our colleagues with New Orleans EMS, fire, and police as they deal with something none of us ever want to have to face. Stick around, because when we get back, we're going to dive into that Austin EMS paper.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy y'all, I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome to episode 93 of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, the podcast where we shine the bright light of science on the darkness of modern clinical practice. In episode 92, we kicked off this series of episodes doing a deep dive on mechanical compression devices, or MCDs. We learned that in a large hospital registry, MCDs were associated with lower survival compared to manual CPR. In this episode, I want to discuss a paper that profoundly influenced my understanding of mechanical CPR and how things that seem to be no-brainers often turn out differently than we assume. Now, for full disclosure, I am good friends with most of the authors on this paper. One of the authors, Jeff Hayes, is my daughter's godfather. I taught paramedics at Temple College with Lewis, the principal author. They wrote this paper at a time when I was the medical director for Williamson County EMS, that's in suburban Austin, and most of the other authors on this paper were their Austin medical directors, and we got together often to talk about EMS medicine, and we definitely talked about this issue, and I saw what they were seeing while they worked on this paper. All right, so with that disclosure out of the way, let's dive in. The title is Out of Hospital Cardiac Arrest Outcomes with Pit Crew Resuscitation and Scripted Initiation of Mechanical CPR. Louis Gonzales is the lead author, and the other authors are Brandon Oyler, Jeff Hayes, Mark Escott, Jose Cabanas, Paul Hinchey, and the great Lawrence Brown. This was published in 2018 in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. They report on the impact of a QI effort they undertook the previous year. Now, Austin had a very long history of training intensely on pit crew CPR. Now, pit crew in Austin meant extensive practice at providing minimally interrupted chest compressions, early defibrillation, and using a supraglottic as the primary airway. Austin Fire implemented Lucas devices on about 30% of their engines over a few years. Now, prior to Lucas implementation, Austin Fire trained extensively on this pit crew choreography, and they were really, really good at it. The Austin Office of the Medical Director, or OMD, had an extensive performance monitoring system in place both before and after this Lucas implementation, including participation in CARES, where they abstracted all of their data going into CARES. And CARES, if you're not familiar with it by now, that's the U.S. Cardiac Arrest Registry. They noticed a decrease in survival around the time of Lucas implementation, so they undertook a QI effort to identify the reasons for this decrease in survival and develop improvement strategies. So they brought in 26 fire and EMS crews, and they ran them through a series of cardiac arrest scenarios, both with and without MCDs. They took careful observations of what was going on, took lots of notes, including timing of the interventions. They then went through and figured out, as they analyzed this data, that applying the Lucas was leading to prolonged interruptions in chest compressions, and that was happening without the crews being aware of it. That's similar to what was found in Anchorage in the Levy paper. They then went through multiple tests of change to develop a specific checklist-driven, phased-in approach to applying the Lucas. So they applied the Lucas in multiple different steps, all timed to minimize interruptions. Once they had optimized that process, they then trained extensively on it throughout the AFD and Austin EMS systems, and they focused on decreasing times, and their data showed they decreased application time, decreased interruptions. So they had optimized both their manual approaches to CPR and their Lucas application. They then evaluated the following year's worth of data to look at cardiac arrest and see what the impact of changes were on survival, the things that patients care most about. So in this way, they have a year of data on cardiac arrest using a protocol of highly choreographed pit crew CPR, with some arrest also having heavily scripted, focused implementation of the Lucas. This allowed them to compare outcomes between those patients who had a Lucas and those who did not. Now, I mentioned they only put it on 30% of their units, so the distribution of where the Lucas showed up was not randomized. Instead, what they did was deploy the Lucas to fire stations with the highest volume of cardiac arrest. Now, that makes great operational sense, certainly what I would have done, but because of it, there was a potential that the patients who got the Lucas might have somehow been different than those who didn't, creating a possible bias. And by bias here, I mean a research bias, not an intentional bias about who gets it or who didn't. Again, the deployment strategy was sound. It just created an issue with the research between comparing these two groups. So the authors had to figure out a way to address it. And what they did was went with a propensity matched study that paired patients who got the MCD to similar patients who matched multiple characteristics of age and witnessed arrest and response times, all of those things. They matched patients who got the MCD to those who did not. And then to see whether that propensity matching was successful, after the fact, they compared the baseline characteristics between the two groups and found that they ended up with two evenly matched groups with minimal differences that made for a really good comparison. So they included all adult non-traumatic cardiac arrest, and they abstracted data both from their EPCRs and from CARES. Now, because they wanted to minimize this resuscitation time bias, where resuscitation is stopped before crews had a chance to use MCDs, which might either bias in favor of those patients or against, meaning if they get ROSC back really quickly and didn't have time to use the MCDs, that would make manual CPR look better. And if they stopped early because, say, a DNR showed up, that would bias against manual CPR. So to deal with that, they excluded patients with ROSC or termination that occurred before advanced airways defibrillation or medications were used. Now, they also excluded EMS witnessed arrest. So their primary outcome was survival to hospital discharge, and secondary outcomes included neurologic survival, rates of field termination, and rates of sustained ROSC. That is, you get pulses back and keep those pulses for at least 20 minutes. So in 2016, the year they did the study, they had a little over 700 adult arrests, and they had to exclude 256 cases for the reasons we just described. That left them with 444 arrests from which to draw their matched sample. 51% of these had mechanical CPR and 49% didn't. They ended up getting good matches on 176 MCD patients. So their final analysis had 176 in the MCD and 176 in the manual only. Well, what were the bottom line results? Here we go. You ready for this? Survival was lower in the mechanical group compared to the manual group. All right, let's run through the specific numbers looking at the propensity matched analysis. That's the best analysis they got after controlling for differences. What did they find? Survival to hospital discharge, 13.6% in the manual group versus 6.8% in the mechanical. That's an absolute difference of 6.8% higher in the manual group, and the confidence interval goes from 0.5 to 13.3. Now, unlike the confidence intervals around odds ratios, where the point of no difference is 1, the point of no difference around a mechanical difference, this number minus this number, that is 0. So if the entire confidence interval is either positive or negative, then that is statistically significant. Now, because the confidence interval around this difference, this 6.8% difference in survival, was entirely positive, that means it was statistically significant, and a 6.8% improvement in survival to discharge, I would say, is clinically significant also. Now, sustained ROSC for more than 20 minutes was also higher with manual than mechanical. And the numbers were 38.6% versus 28.4%, a difference of 10.2, confidence interval 0.4 to 20. Clinically and statistically significant. Now, neurologically intact survival, that was also higher with the manual group. It was 87.5 versus 83.4, but this was not statistically significant. The confidence interval went from negative 20.4 to positive 28.8, and that was likely because of the small sample sizes. Now, these results held across all subgroups, including gender and race, witnessed versus unwitnessed, bystander CPR versus not, AED use versus non, and location of the arrest, with the exception of arrest that occurred in nursing homes in which there was no difference. It also held for shockable rhythms versus non-shockable rhythms. In all of these groups, manual CPR had higher survival than mechanical. So the bottom line is this paper looked at the impact of MCDs on survival in a high-functioning EMS system that optimized both manual and mechanical CPR. They did all of the things that are recommended to use mechanical CPR the right way, and they still showed worse outcomes. Now, I really like this paper, and I think they did an amazing job designing the analysis and writing it up. If you're going to read anything on MCDs, please read this discussion. I mean, read the whole paper, but definitely the discussion. In this discussion, they specifically call out an important and pretty worrisome finding. That is that survival among those patients with shockable rhythms, meaning those most likely to survive with good resuscitation, survival in that group was markedly lower with mechanical CPR, 42% versus 27%. And they point out this was also seen in the paramedic study where they saw a 29% lower survival with mechanical devices. My guess here is that it's suggesting that putting the device on early in the arrest when other things matter so much more, like, say, defibrillation in VFib, that distracts and it's bad. I said it was worrisome. Really, this is worrisome because it suggests that we are actively lowering survival in that group of patients that we should most likely get back if we do our jobs right. Now, there's a quote from this discussion that I want to read because it really resonates with me. They said there was lower survival, and then they went on to say, still, mechanical CPR remains popular among many EMS systems and providers, including with our own system. Some argue there might be a subgroup of patients who do benefit from mechanical CPR, although no studies to date have identified such a subgroup. I like that little passive-aggressive thing there. Actually, I don't know how passive the aggressiveness was there, but well done. They then go on to have a great discussion about several arguments for specific situations where MCDs might be useful, and then they drop this bomb. Quote, any of these could be reasonable arguments for using mechanical CPR if outcomes were in fact equivalent between the two strategies, unquote. Now, their point here is that real-world studies suggest outcomes may not actually be equivalent like was seen in the optimized randomized trials. And if this is true, our logistical arguments for MCD use take on a much different flavor. What do I mean by that? Well, yes, MCDs may reduce clinician fatigue, but is that worth worse outcomes? Yes, MCDs may allow for cognitive offloading, that's great, but is that worth worse outcomes? The one argument I don't think this changes is the one about clinician safety during transport. Multiple studies show dismal survival among patients transported with ongoing CPR. So if for whatever reason we have to do CPR during transport, the patient's chances of survival rapidly approach zero, but the clinician's odds of survival are pretty good, assuming they are not killed in a collision in which they're an unrestrained projectile because they're unbelted in the back doing futile compressions. Because of this, I think MCD use during transport clearly indicated and should be as close to mandatory as possible, assuming you have the devices, obviously. Now, one last thing I want to bring up here is a conversation I had earlier today with Dr. Jason Pickett. Jason was one of Austin's medical directors in the period right after this study, and he knows that system well. So he was saying that one reason he thought there were better outcomes with manual CPR in that group is because of the amazing job EMS and Fire in Austin does constantly working on their CPR choreography. Now, before I read the Crowley paper we covered in that last episode, I would have bought that argument. But now that I've read it, I'm not so sure. Why is that? Well, I don't know about you, but I have never seen CPR done in a hospital that is nearly as good as even the most marginal EMS code. Remember, that study excluded arrest run in the ER, which I'd argue is better at arrest than anywhere else in the hospital, but still not as good as an optimally run EMS code. So I don't buy the arguments that Austin saw better survival with manual CPR only because they're so good at it, because the hospitals also showed better survival with manual CPR, and they most definitely are not great at it. Now, I know exceptions to this exist. Some hospitals do a great job of this, but that paper covered 153 different hospitals, and I am not buying that there was a bunch of excellent CPR going on the floor in ICUs. Now, please understand, I'm not trashing my hospital-based colleagues here. We in EMS are used to training in teams, and we generally know who we're going to be working codes with, and we're all working off the same script. Not so much in hospitals. They have purely ad hoc teams. They don't have the same opportunity to train as a team as we do, and they definitely don't operate off protocols the way we do. So their CPR is just not as good as ours. And that's why I don't buy the argument that Austin saw worse survival with MCDs because they're so good at CPR. I mean, they are, but we see the same thing in hospital codes where CPR isn't great. Now, I'm not going to go over all the reasons I think these results are real again, since I just did that in the last episode. But I will say one more time that this paper by Lewis and his colleagues really influenced how I think about this issue. I really do urge y'all to read this discussion. It's such a great argument, and it's an argument well made. So that's it for episode 93. I'm still kind of thinking over what mechanical CPR paper to cover in the next episode. So I'm just going to wrap up here by thanking y'all for listening and thanking you for what you do every day for your communities. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.